Hello, I'm super excited to be here today at one of my favorite conferences, Clarity, to talk to you about CSS and custom properties and color in my talk, Calculating Color, Dynamic Theming with CSS Variables. My name is Una, this is me. I am a web developer advocate on the Chrome team focusing on CSS and web development and design. So if you have any additional questions or want to find me online, you can tweet at me at Twitter, I'm just at UNA, and on GitHub, I'm Una, so that is where you can find me. This is my dog Disco, a very important part of my life, and I'm sad that he couldn't be here today. But the good news of this remote life is that he gets to be with me all the time. Here's him in our office, and now I get to see him in my home office. So just wanted to make you happy before I dove into this talk with a little Disco shot. So what we're going to learn today is a variety of topics surrounding color and using color and math and calculating color. So we're going to talk about dynamic CSS variables. We're going to talk about CSS math functions. We're going to talk about different color types. And finally, we're going to talk about color functions. At the end, I'm also going to discuss a little bit about the upcoming CSS Color 5 spec so that you know what spec editors are talking about and what to expect for the future of color on the web. So let's start with dynamic CSS variables. Now there's a few different types of CSS variables. The first one is currentColor. And currentColor is pretty cool because it is very well supported. So here's an example of using currentColor. In this button, I have currentColor specified as not just the color on the text of the button, but also as the border. So I'm using it to adjust the border, and when I use a hover or focus state on this button, so here I'm hovering on it, you can see that I'm updating this color value to dark turquoise. But the cool thing about currentColor is it doesn't just update the color value of the text within this button, it's also then updating the border color. And that's because you can set currentColor to any other place in CSS to make it use that color value that's dynamically updated via the color property. So you can use it for something like this. Here I have just a little message counter, and I'm using a number here, and I'm again using currentColor to create this effect here. I can change the color of this to red, and now both the text and the background of messages is red, and this is because I'm using a mix of currentColor and overriding that for the color of this text on messages to be that currentColor while the actual text of it is white. So you can really start to expand currentColor. And the reason why I think it is really exciting as a CSS property value is because it is really well supported. Like I said, it goes all the way back to IE9. So you can definitely be using this in your UIs today. And it is the first CSS variable. There's also var. And var is probably what you think of when you think of CSS variables. With var, you can set it in the root and the HTML. You can actually even set it within any element itself and really scope it to that element. But here I'm setting the color primary to be lavender in the root. I have this link background where I'm updating it to be pulling from this color primary. So when I'm setting the background color of this button, I'm setting it to the link background. And that is going to in turn pull from lavender. So if I update this to yellow, you can see that this color is propagating through these variables. It's updating link background, which is then updating background color. I can change that back to lavender. And then when I hover or focus on this, it's updating it to this wheat color. So just like with currentColor, you can update this in your UIs, but unlike currentColor, it's not limited to the text color. So you can use it on backgrounds here, which you couldn't do with currentColor. You can use it on borders. You can use it anywhere in your CSS. And it's not just limited to color. var is super useful. You can use it for individual values, which we will get to. With var, it's decently well supported across all modern browsers, but with older browsers like Internet Explorer, there is not support. So you likely will have to use a post-CSS polyfill or some other way to make sure that your users in older browsers are able to see and access and experience the variables that builds up your website. So this is what that fallback would look like. This is the post-CSS polyfill. And here, what you're seeing is something that you would have specified as color red as a color in the root that you're using as a color value for H1. This would become a static variable. So that would be converted to a static variable. And then after that, you would have the dynamic variable of color. And this way, you can make sure that users with older browsers are still able to see something, still able to get content. It might not be dynamic content, but they're still having an experience. And it's a pretty straightforward polyfill using post-CSS. Now there's also the @property variable value, and this is a part of the CSS Houdini API. Specifically, it is a part of the Properties and Values API, which is shipped in many modern browsers such as Chrome, Edge, Opera, and also in Samsung Internet, but it is currently in development in Firefox, and there's not a lot of support in Safari either. So this has partial support, and what this table is referring to specifically is the JavaScript-based CSS version of this, where you're doing a CSS.register property. So you still have to write that in JavaScript. But what I want to show you is the CSS version, which recently launched in the latest version of Chromium. Now, to understand @property, I think it's best to explain what happens without @property, what happens without a registered custom property. Here we have a gradient. I have a button here with the background, and I'm setting the gradient from color A to color B. It's going from violet to light blue, and then I want to transition it. I want to give it a ½ second transition, and then when I hover or focus on this button, it is going to convert to tomato and pink. So as I'm hovering over it, I could even tab focus into it. You can see that there's not that 0.5 second transition. There's not this ability to respect that. And it's because the browser currently reads CSS variables that are derived this way as strings. So it doesn't understand that these strings can be interpolated from one value to another value. So the difference with @property is when you specify these colors, here I'm setting the grad color 1. I'm not just giving it a name, but I'm also giving it a syntax. I'm giving it an initial value, and I'm stating whether it inherits from its parent or not. So this way, now that I have identified the syntax for these colors, when I have this code, which is the same, I'm transitioning it from one color to the other on hover and focus, there's a smooth transition because I've now told the browser what this color value means, the syntax for this color value. So you can do other things. Here I like this effect of just moving the gradient because you can set this not just to color but also to percentage. There's a wide variety of syntaxes available for Houdini custom properties, and a really exciting thing is that now you don't have to write it in your JavaScript file, you can write it in your CSS file. And this is a newer syntax, so again, there's no browser support for this yet. However, if you do want to use this syntax in browsers that do support the Properties and Values API, you can use this PostCSS polyfill by Jonathan Neal. You can write your properties with @property, and then what that's going to do is convert it to a JSON format where it has all this information, and it's then going to use the syntax from the JavaScript implementation of CSS.register property and run through your JSON file and then register those to your code base. So you're still able to use the syntax that's more concise within your CSS and get all that goodness. But let's focus on var, because this is what we're going to be using today to deconstruct some colors and use them to create color functions. So we're going to focus on not just var, but also the HSL color spectrum. HSL stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. And what this allows us to do is specify how light a color value is, from a dark value like black all the way up to white, and 50% gray would be right in the middle of that. The saturation of the color, so this would be from the 50% gray desaturated value all the way to that really, really rich, vibrant shade. And then the hue, which is like a circle on the color wheel, of which we decide whether that's a red color, a yellow color, and anything in between. So this comes in really handy because we can take that and apply it. And in this example, I've created this sort of pure CSS color theming where I've identified a place that you can just adjust some values. Here, I'll make this secondary color orange, and then we get a light value, a dark value, a complementary value, a triadic value, and this is all done dynamically in the browser using CSS. And so it's just a really cool dynamic capability that you have as a CSS developer to create entire color palettes and themes with a few lines of code. So let's see how we did this. Let's break it down. Now, the first thing that you want to do is identify your brand color and break that into components. So here we have this HSL color, 265, 100% is the saturation, and then 47% is the lightness. If we broke that down, it looks like this. So we have 265 is the color brand H for hue. We have 100% is the color brand S for saturation, and 47% is the color brand L or lightness. So this is what we're going to use to actually now construct our color. Color brand is now going to be a conglomeration of the hue, saturation, and lightness values that we have broken up. So it becomes var, color brand H, color brand S, and color brand L all within an HSL statement. So I can actually change this hue to 65. I can set it to 165 or 265. I can decrease the saturation. I could make it 0%. We see that 50% gray there for the saturation. I could adjust the lightness here to be darker, and it will update dynamically because of the dynamic aspect of the CSS custom properties. I think that's pretty cool. So let's start recreating some functions. The first function that is inspired by Sass and inspired by all of these great capabilities that Sass gave us is the lighten function. So in order to do that, we have to first identify a lightness transform value. And here we're using 15% just as a given value to start with. Then we want to update our CSS custom property value. So now we want to set color brand and then a light version of the luminosity. So here we have color brand light L. And then when we're writing our new color brand light value, we use the regular hue, the regular saturation, and then that lightened version of the luminosity. So altogether, it looks like this. And if we want to increase the lightness, we can do that. If we want to decrease it, we can do that as well. But this really creates dynamic ability to create functionality and functions within your CSS, color themes, and your design systems. Now let's focus on darken, which is sort of like the exact opposite of lighten. So in this example, we have a darkness transform with a negative 20% value. We're again going to create that darkened luminosity value for the brand color and put it all together as the regular hue, saturation, and the darken lightness. So here we have the darken version of this, and this could be even darker. You can actually split this. So if I was going to make this a minus with a positive darken transform, you can use this variable here instead of darkness transform. We can just call it a light transform and then make this the light transform and have this add. And if it was a negative value, then it would darken. If it was a positive value, it would lighten. So this also allows for more dynamicism and extensibility in your color functions, just in vanilla CSS. We can do all this with calculations. I think it's really cool. So next we're going to talk about the complementary color. So let's move away from the luminosity spectrum and move into the hue spectrum. With a complementary color, what we're looking for is the opposite side of the color wheel. So with red, that's blue. With purple, that's a green color. And then with orange, that's a blue color. So here, again, we're going to pull in our color brand. This we're looking for the hue here, so color brand H. We're going to get the complement of H by adding 180 to it. So it goes 180 degrees around that color wheel. You can also subtract, you get the same result. So then we're going to pull it all together for that color brand complement here, and we get the complement colors, the hue, and then the saturation and lightness remain. So we have our brand color, and then we have our complementary color, which is this bright green, and that makes sense. It's a saturated bright green with about 50% lightness, and it's 180 degrees opposite of this purple color on the color wheel. So let's take that a step further now and look at triads. With triads, we're not going 180 degrees on the color wheel. We're cutting this into threes. So we're creating this triad of color, this triangle of color on the color wheel. So in order to get the triadic color, you can think of 360 degrees as going from one point all the way on the color wheel. So 360 divided by 3 is 120. And now we're going to add 120. We're going to subtract 120 from this color brand H. We're just skipping the step of having that being its own independent variable and just writing it directly in this new variable called the triad 1 and triad 2. And then if we look at the color values, we have brands, we have triad 1, and we have triad 2. So we can get some really interesting results by mixing colors. You can create entire color themes from 1 or 2 colors for your entire application and design system. Next is color mix. And mixing colors is one of the things that I really loved about Sass, this functionality that let you specify 2 different colors and then identify how much of each color you wanted to mix. So I'm going to show you a basic version of mixing by 50%, which would be the default value in Sass if you didn't specify a percentage. So in order to mix with our brand color, we have to specify a second color to mix. And here we have the hue, saturation, and lightness of a second color. We pulled it together in its own variable called color2. So we have color brand and we have color2. So here's our brand color, here's color2, and we're going to mix them. As I mentioned, we're just going to average them. We're going to take color brand's hue and color2's hue, and we're going to add them. And then we're going to divide that number by 2. With the saturation, we do the same thing. We take the average. We add them and we divide by 2. And then with lightness, again, the same thing. So when all is said and done, we get a new color value. We get the average of the hue for the brand color and the second color, as well as the saturation and luminosity, the lightness. So it looks like this. Color mixed is all of those color values pulled together. And then when we look at these color values, we start with the brand again. Then we have color2. And what do they look like when they mix? They look like this. So I made a little code pen where I'm doing this. And I think it's really cool to just like inspect this and add the color and see what's happening, because this is just done entirely with CSS. And here I have these color values. Here's color 1. I'm just going to like change a little bit. As I decrease the hue from a blue to a green, you can see that that mixed color is also adjusting. I could decrease the lightness, which also darkens that mixed color with the saturation as well, desaturate it. The second color I can also adjust, maybe make it a deeper blue or a deeper green value. And so you can see as I'm adjusting these 2 color values by their individual components, this mixed color is sort of falling in line. And there's a lot that you can do here. You can even adjust it so it's not perfectly even at 50%. You would just have to apply those calculations yourself. So the next function I want to talk about is definitely a tricky one, and it is called contrast color. And this is something that Sass provided that identified the more contrasted of 2 color values and made that the primary color on top of a given background color. And this is for accessibility reasons. So we're going to sort of recreate this in a hacky way using vanilla CSS. And the first thing that we want to do is set a contrast threshold. And here that contrast threshold is 60%. And then we write a switch. So here we're calculating based on the luminosity. So it's not perfect. It's not a perfect algorithm, but we are using the luminosity value to identify where the brightness is. We're multiplying that by -100%. So if the background of the value, which is going to be the color brand, where we're using the color brand, if the luminosity of that is very light, the color on top of it will be a black color. If it is darker, if the luminosity value is less than 60%, it will be a white color on top of that. So what does that look like? When I am adjusting the color here, if I change this darker purple to like a lighter lavender, you can see that now the color on top of it that says primary base, that says primary light, has become black instead of white. And if I'm adjusting this color and I make it a dark value, it stays white. If I make it a light value up here, if the luminosity is adjusting to a very light value, those also become black, and that's so that you can read the color value on top of this. Now this is a little limited because we are using just luminosity. We're not really getting a full range of color from this, so you might have some things where it's not perfectly legible, but it is a way to recreate some of these color functions in vanilla CSS, which I think is really cool. I probably said that 40 times during this talk. So with dynamic color systems, you can use these for creating entire application systems through 1 or 2 or even 3 variables. You can use this for buttons. You can use it for card accents. You can use it really seamlessly in design systems. That's why I thought that this talk would be great for this conference. You can also use them in web components, and this is actually something that I ran into when I was working on the material design team. We were rebuilding our app components into web components, and a struggle there was because the previous system was using Sass and static variables, we weren't able to actually update theming inside of those web components. But with custom properties, because they are dynamic, you can reach inside of the web component from the outside and create this sort of dynamic color theming system for your users. This is also great for light and dark modes, for contrast modes. You can update the variables and have an entirely different UI style with just a few lines of code. You can use custom properties to do this. You can use media queries, prefers media queries to do these sorts of translations. So I think that this is great for dynamic color systems and web components, and also just browser art. I've seen some really cool, different artistic effects done with custom properties, and I definitely encourage that on the web. So it's not just for business, it's also for play. And again, if you do have to support older browsers, you can use a post-CSS polyfill. You will not have those dynamic capabilities that I was mentioning, but you could create your color theme this way, and your users will still see the output color because the browser will then determine a static value and serve that to users who are on older browsers. So before I wrap this talk, I do want to talk about the future of color on the web and what spec editors are talking about. And I do want to say a disclaimer that this is not a standard yet, but this is where the browser is going to enable some of these color functions on the web natively. Hopefully, we all hope. I think that this is really important to have in the browser. So this is called CSS Color 5, and it is a spec on which I am an editor and working to hopefully make some of these things come to life. The first function that is in the spec is color mix, and this allows you to, like my mix example, take two colors and specify the mix percentage. So here we're mixing 40% of this light goldenrod with Peru. And here we're using the LCH scale to do the mixing. It has affordances for a larger color gamut and also for chroma and how users see color. So it is a really nice place to apply color mixing, especially when you have two colors from different color ranges and color sets. But in this case, you can see that we're able to use this color mix and create this function natively with this CSS function that I hope gets implemented. Here's another example of using that with LCH color, which again is a really wonderful color system and gamut, and we are able to specify what we want to mix. So here we're specifying that we only want to mix the hue of one color to another. And that's interesting because we don't currently have that capability in the browser and in any design software really. So I think it's a really cool thing to be able to really pinpoint and make these small adjustments that can make a big difference in our UIs. There's also color contrast, which, as I was demonstrating in a sort of more hacky way, allows you to specify a color with the greatest contrast from a list of colors. So if we have a list of colors here, sienna, your accent color, this D2B, which is this tan color, you're looking for the color which has the greatest contrast ratio with the color that you put first. So in the end, if this accent color is this red B2222, that is what is going to appear to create contrast between the background and the foreground, the color on the background. This is also a very useful function from Sass that I miss having in CSS. There's also color adjust, which lets you apply a color adjustment like lightness or hue or saturation or chroma to a single color. You have the single color and the adjustment, and you can get a new color out of that. And you would be using all of these on the right-hand side of your statement in CSS, so you can use them anywhere, not just foreground color, background color, borders, shadows, anywhere really. So if you're interested in color functions in the spec, check out this link. It is at w3.org. And again, this is a spec draft. It is nowhere near from completion, but it is where the W3C is having conversations and thinking about for the future of CSS color and how we can define color functions on the web. So thank you so much for listening to this talk. If you want to hear more CSS, check out one of my two podcasts. The first one is called the CSS Podcast. You can find that link at pod.link/CSS Podcast. The second one is more generalized web development called Tools Day. That is a Spec FM podcast. And I also have a web series called Designing in the Browser on the Chrome Developers YouTube channel. We just launched a new series on accessibility, and our last series is all about designing in the browser. So there are a ton of things to learn about there. And again, I appreciate you. Feel free to tweet at me. And I'm looking forward to chatting with you all. Bye.
YouTube channel. We just launched a Holy magic, Una. That was amazing. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. How are you?
I'm doing very well. I have a quick question for you. Do you know why the Scarecrow won an award?
Why?
Because he was outstanding in his field.
I love that you're doing these because when I emceed Clarity, I did like really bad, nerdy dad jokes that were code related, and doing them in front of people is hard, but it must be even harder just sitting in the room by yourself.
You leave some big MC shoes to fill because you brought a ukulele. So I'm not sure. I don't know. Maybe I'll play the piano.
But nobody laughed at my dad jokes. It was just like, oh,
good.
Which I think they were all right.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Let's talk about all of this color stuff that you shared. This is great. I bet you get this question all the time. So maybe we'll start here, which part of the appeal that some people have of CSS is that it's a simple language. It's easy to learn. I can make web pages with it. Doesn't all this stuff make CSS more confusing? It turns it into programming and it makes it unappealing. What do you say to people who are like, I don't want all this power in CSS? How do you get them over that hump?
Well, I think that's exactly why we're constantly evolving CSS. It's about making it easier for the developer. It's not about adding complexity. So by implementing these color functions, the developer no longer needs to have a third-party processor or have to do all of this weird math inside of their style sheets. They can just do the calculation they want. They just say color mix or color adjust, and then it should, in theory, make it easier. And that's where this paving the cow path concept comes in, where if people are doing something a lot, we should make that a shortcut and make it easier for them to do.
Yeah, interesting. I remember just a quick anecdote here. I remember this was maybe 2003 or 4 or something like that. A friend of mine, Mark Hewitt, and we made a thing called Swiffer, not to be confused with Sean Inman's Cipher. And Swiffer was a thing that we had a Flash file that used a little bit of JavaScript to pass images into Flash so that you could do rounded corners and rotation on images, because we couldn't do that in CSS. And then once CSS3 came out, where you could do rounded corners and borders and that kind of stuff, we retired that library. Do you have the opinion that JavaScript and preprocessors and all that stuff are things where we can prototype new technologies that eventually should always make their way into the browser? And into CSS and client-side kind of browser tools? Or do you think there are some things that should stay in JavaScript world or preprocessor world and not make its way more into browser kind of client-side languages?
So I think it's really interesting that you bring this up, because really recently a new CSS property came out called content visibility. And what content visibility does is it prevents paint layout containment. It basically prevents your element from applying layout and paint and sizing it and doing the geometric shape until it enters the screen. So what content visibility is doing is it's doing all these performance adjustments automatically through CSS instead of through JavaScript, instead of through lazy loading, so that your content is still in the DOM, it's still searchable, it's still accessible to screen readers, everything like that. So what I'm seeing now is this shift from everything in JavaScript to everything in the place where you need it. And I like thinking of this difference as keeping your logic, your application logic in your JavaScript and keeping the styling in CSS. So even thinking of performance, I think typically we don't really think about CSS as the place where we inject performance, but why not? CSS is the place that we write our layouts and our styles, and why not have that be the place that we also mention that, oh, I want this paint contained until it enters the viewport.
Yeah, interesting. I remember when CSS animations first kind of made their way. I think at first they came into WebKit, and then they became more available across browsers. I was really hesitant about that, because up until that point, I always saw animations that's a JavaScript thing or a Flash thing or something like that. And I felt really hesitant at the idea that belonged in CSS. But now that it is in CSS, we're years past that. We're starting to see, or not starting to see, we have seen all of the benefits of that kind of stuff, from performance to being able to render it on the GPU. All of that kind of stuff happens. And so it makes a lot of sense. But I think there probably are a lot of designers and engineers that might be kind of reticent at the idea of moving it into a language like CSS. How do you start to have that conversation with them?
The thing about CSS is it's always going to be a shorthand for things that
maybe are more complex in JavaScript. So you give animations as an example. You can still write animations in JavaScript. The Web Animations API is heavily JavaScript, but you can call it in CSS, and you can do a lot in CSS. I think that CSS filters are another great example of this. CSS filters are shorthands for SVG filter effects. So instead of writing an FE color matrix or writing an FE blend on every single channel, you have a sepia shorthand, which is already pre-calculated for you. So I think that what the CSS authors are trying to do, again, is just make it easier for the developer to create the effects that they're already creating in other ways. If they can't do it in CSS yet and it makes sense for it to be in CSS, then it should probably be in CSS.
Yeah, interesting. Your talk, there were so many questions in the chat already by the time we got here, so let's do some audience questions too. Since we're talking about performance a bit, Sean asked a question. She says, I'm exploring generating large sets of tokens and colors, for example, blue 0 all the way to blue 1000, and outputting CSS variables at compile time. Is there a performance impact to that? Or is there such thing as like too many of those are really going to impact performance?
So this is something that we did run into a material where having a lot of CSS variables did end up impacting performance. And when I brought this back to the team on Chrome, they were saying that this shouldn't be a problem unless you have, I forgot what the number was, but it was like thousands, which is possible. But I think that what the browser is constantly trying to do is prevent that from being an issue. Like, that sounds like a bug to me. I think currently you might have some performance issues if you have, I forgot what the number was. I think it was like 30,000. It was something really big. But I can see that if you're using things like breaking up HSL and like doing all these transformations everywhere, all over your application, it could add up for sure.
Yeah, got it. Can we talk about the designer part of this? Christy has a question. She says, like, I love systematically generated palettes. Have you found any pushback or resistance from designers into using generated palettes like this? And kind of a related question there is, like, how do you translate the palettes for designers then? Even if you're kind of playing with them in the browser, how does this get into kind of design tool world like Figma, Sketch, or Photoshop, things like that?
I think that a lot of teams have been putting out dynamically generated color palettes recently. Some of the work that Mr. Mrs. Murmurs has been putting out is all dynamically generated color palettes. The Lift color system is dynamically generated. And so I think that a big benefit of dynamic color generation is that you get automatic accessibility testing when you do color transformations that way. Now, this is probably going to be like a JavaScript-based system, not something that is like doing this kind of hacky color math that I was showing here. But I think that the trend is continuing to be dynamic. And this really helps when you have a lot of brands. If you're a company like Fox Media, where you own SB Nation and Polygon, or I used to work at a brand called Bustle, where we had 8 or 9 different individual online websites that had the same components. They were all using the same React components, but they were all using different styles. So if you can use something like this where you're reusing logic, but like applying these adjustments based on a theme, it really helps to quickly create these visual assets that look very different, but are still using the same base logic.
Yeah, got it. Do you see any places where Sass is actually better, or using a preprocessor like that is actually better than doing it in straight up CSS?
So for something like this, I'd probably use post CSS. I love Sass. I love the Sass community, but I do not like additional build steps typically when you might not need them. And if you are using Sass, I would still recommend using CSS Custom Properties for their dynamic nature. So there are definitely more controlled functions in Sass. When you're using Sass, the functions there are going to give you a, what's the word? A reliable result, a reliable result. And hopefully that's what these new CSS color functions will also give you. So I think that Sass has really inspired a lot of what CSS has become, and a lot of Sass has now entered CSS. Even nesting in CSS is also something that we're talking about implementing and putting in the browser. So a lot of the thought behind Sass, which was a really thoughtful approach to how people write CSS, is sort of seeping into native CSS. And I think that that's sort of the way it should be.
Got it. let's talk a little bit about maybe the elephant in the room, or the obvious place that this ties into design systems, which is design tokens. Right? How do you see some of the techniques that you shared? How do they work with design tokens, which are traditionally ported into like JSON files or SAS variables or things like that? How does the methodologies and tools that you shared, how do you think that works with design tokens, or how have you maybe used them in relation to design tokens?
There's so many ways that you can use this with design tokens. The first is just directly in JavaScript. So if you are importing your design tokens through JSON file in JavaScript, you can set your root variables either globally in your base through JavaScript. You can just have your styles there, or you can set it inline in any parent element. So you could have just the base root styles be updated with the components there, or you can import your tokens inside of your CSS and use them there. So there are like 1,000 solutions for this, but ultimately I think this plays really nicely with design tokens.
Yeah, cool. Do you see this as like a playground kind of thing? Like, is this something where you can play around with colors, or how do you use them in a production environment? Like, you're building products and you're building apps and things like that. How do you see using these kind of tools? Is this about like designing in the browser and being collaborative and things like that?
I actually think that this is something you can absolutely use in production. The reason being is because CSS variables are very well supported in modern browsers, and for IE 11, I believe it goes back to IE 9, there's a great polyfill that will simply convert your CSS custom properties into a static value. So you still get baseline experience for your users. It's not going to be dynamic. So if somebody was updating the custom properties, they're not going to see an updated version if you're in IE 11, but your users will still see the base experience. So that is sort of how it's written, and then the line after that will be the custom property. So when you're using these kinds of calculations, they're totally valid production code if you want to use them. I think that I would use a post-CSS polyfill if I needed any sort of adjustments or color mixing values here in CSS, and then it just makes me excited for the future.
Right. Awesome. Last question. We have one more from the chat from Giancarlo. Giancarlo asked if you think things like color contrast can help produce like dark mode supported components and things like that. Like, could that help to do things like theming like that?
Yeah, I mean, you could make the dark mode just dynamically do like a darken function if you want. But I will say that when you are designing dark modes, there's a lot that goes into it, so I wouldn't recommend this. One of the things that I really like from material design is the idea that you desaturate your really vivid colors, because on darker colors, they look like they're too much, they vibrate too much. The idea that when you want to create depth, you bring things forward instead of push them, bring them forward with light colors instead of add shadows, because you're not going to see that shadow on the dark background. So while I think that using custom properties is the best way to design for dark themes, I don't think that using an automated theme generator to do all those calculations for you is necessarily going to give you the results and the attention that a dark theme deserves.
Yeah, got it. This is awesome. Thank you so much for this. This is really cool stuff. Thank you for sharing it. Everybody's nerding out about all this, and I bet everyone's going to kind of go back and play with some of this stuff within their design systems. Thanks for sharing everything that you just did.
Great. Thank you so much. And thank you all for watching. I appreciate you.